Mikhail Bakhtin is an interesting historical figure. His biography is shrouded in mystery due to myths he either actively spread or failed or refused to clear up while he was alive. These include the question of his education. He borrowed his brother Nikolai's degree and claimed part of his close friend Matvei Kagan's educational resume. To his disputed text, works written by his friends and Bakhtin circle colleagues Valentin Voloshinov and Pavel Medvedev, which were attributed by some to him, or his borrowing of wholesale passages from Ernst Cassier's work on the Renaissance for his work on Rabelais. We might question why we should even look at such a person. The simple fact is that Bakhtin ties together a series of threads of thought into a fabric of a theory. Perhaps theory is the wrong word here, though. Bakhtin, who saw himself alternately as a philologist or a philosopher, unites a number of philosophical traditions that surrounded him at the time. Born in 1895, Bakhtin's early life is hard to separate from his mythology. What we do know and can confirm is that he was in Petrograd, possibly informally attending classes in the period before the revolution. There he met Kagan, whose education would affect Bakhtin deeply. In the late teens and early 1920s, Bakhtin was a member of a circle, later dubbed the Bakhtin Circle, which included the previously named Voloshinov, Medvedev, and Kagan, among others. Most likely, Kagan was at the center of the circle. During this period, Bakhtin produced two fragments, Towards the Philosophy of the Act and Author and Hero in Aesthetic Activity, and the book Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. It's in these works that he lays out his early ideas of dialogue, which he will pick up and modify in various contexts throughout the years. He does not start with an idea and develop it fully, but he will move to ideas on the novel, the 1930s, deal with Carnival in the 1930s through the 1960s, then return back to the quote-unquote human sciences in the 1970s, just prior to his death in 1975. I see that theory may be a wrong word for what Bakhtin developed. A theory has a sense of a well laid out series of ideas approaching a single problem. Bakhtin doesn't do that. The works Towards the Philosophy of the Act and Author and Hero were fragments, and while Bakhtin lists plans on what he will do with them and what ideas he will develop later, there's no evidence he ever went further. These remain just simply fragments. After that, he shifts to Dostoevsky in the polyphonic novel and the nature of discourse in Dostoevsky's work, then to the novel, then to, you get the picture. Bakhtin begins in Toward the Philosophy of the Act by trying to understand interaction. Dialogic interaction always involves at least two consciousnesses. Someone who contemplates a rock is not engaging in a dialogic interaction with the rock. It does not have a consciousness. There's nothing to penetrate. But an author creating a character in a novel does interact with that person. We can treat people like things and move away from the dialogic, but we can never totally treat the person like a complete object. They are always going to maintain some subjectivity, no matter how much we try to erase that. Bakhtin believes that all interaction, on some level, is dialogic. He writes, "Life by its very nature is dialogic. To live means to participate in dialogue, to ask questions, to heed, to respond, to agree, and so forth. A person invests its entire self in discourse, and this discourse enters into the dialogic fabric of human life, into the world symposium." As I stated earlier, Bakhtin attempts to understand how this interaction works. In order to do this, he finds two primary and fundamental positions or moments in interaction: I, or the self, and other. Both of these positions occupy a concrete, unique physical space. Both the self and the other have what Bakhtin terms a surplus of vision, meaning that each person can see or know something about the other that the other does not see or know about himself or herself. For example, the other person can't see their own face except through some type of mediation like a mirror or a window glass. The other cannot see what's happening behind them, or they can't see whether or not those pants make his or her tuchus look large. The self has to interact with the other through language, through mediation, to give that information so that in that way both self and other help their counterpart to, so quote-unquote, fill in the gaps. Bakhtin divides the self into two parts: I for myself, which is an internal part, and the I for the other, which is an external part. The I for myself is how the individual's consciousness feels from the inside. This involves not only physical sensation, but also understanding and willing. I like this or that, I want this or that. That can't be directly seen by the other. The I for the other is the image or face that the self projects to the other, that is constructed by the self using pieces and parts of the I for myself. In other words, the self takes those pieces of information that he or she wants to reveal to the other and puts it together into an external face. I argue elsewhere there is another aspect of the self, the other for me, which is not mentioned by Bakhtin, but this is important because I argue that the other for me stores information that the I uses from time to time. Not everything that the I needs to create an other for me, the I for the other, is always going to be readily available. It has to be stored somewhere. So it keeps that information in the back that's not instantly needed for the situation at hand. Bakhtin refers to the other as the other for me, which is the face of the other, which is, of course, the only part of the other that we can see. Bakhtin insists on understanding interaction on the level of the concrete particular, rather than trying to abstract and generalize from interaction. All interaction is concrete. We can't get away from that. He insists we look at the positions of self and other as actual people living in the actual world. Nothing that exists in interaction is abstract. Nothing can be abstracted out. Nothing can be generalized. Not even the values that suggest how we respond to one another. Bakhtin borrows the concept of the ought, or the ought to do, from Kant. Whereas Kant wanted a universal that affected all situations. He wanted a value or an ought that would be valid in every situation that shared similar content or form. Bakhtin wants an ought that is specific to a given interaction. He writes that, quote, there are no moral norms that are determinate and valid in themselves as moral norms, but there is a moral subjectum. There is a person that's within the interaction. It is this person who, Bakhtin says, understands both the actual and ought-to-be sense of the interrelationship between himself and these persons and objects involved in the interaction. It is up to him or her to decide whether or not to fulfill the ought, aka act morally and ethical in the situation, or to just take your chances by not acting ethically. The interaction takes these universals, takes these morals, norms, mores, societal concerns, etc., and expresses those in particular action. I mentioned earlier Dostoevsky and his relationships with characters. I want to explain this a bit more now in light of what I've just discussed, since it really is a part of how Bakhtin's idea of dialogue gets applied in the areas of psychology and counseling. Bakhtin in the Dostoevsky book notes that Dostoevsky approaches his characters differently than other authors approach their characters. Instead of insisting on a full authorial control of characters where every action is scripted out every word is given by the author to the character, Dostoevsky stands beside them, and he gives them control of their development. They are, in Bakhtin's terms, ideologically authoritative and independent. He, the character, is perceived as the author of a fully weighted ideological conception of his own and not the object of Dostoevsky's finalizing artistic vision. Each character, then, has equal rights in developing themselves as character, and each one has his or her own worldview. The term that Bakhtin uses for this, in this type of character development, this type of novel, is the polyphonic novel. Psychologists like Hubert Herrmanns and others use the sense of the polyphonic novel to understand the individual. This creates a new theory of self that goes along with the other types of self, postmodern self, authoritative self, which is called the dialogical self. Herrmanns also borrows the concept of narrative storied self. And him and his colleagues look at how individuals create sense of what happens to them. Let me give you an example. For every event, there are multiple positions from which we might experience the event. We can only see the event from our own position in relation to it. If there's an accident in an intersection, for example, we experience it from the corner from which we're standing on. We cannot give up our position toward the event and become, let's say, the driver of one of the vehicles or the person on the corner that's the other side of us. Each participant from their position has a surplus of vision toward the other, since they see the event from his or her own vantage point. There's no obsessions here. Pardon. We all have unique experiences in seeing the accident. We all have unique experiences from an emotional, volitional point of view too. I'm going to feel differently about the accident that I witness than, say, the drivers of the vehicles or the passengers in the vehicles. The passengers are going to feel different about what happened than the drivers, so on. In short, we're all going to have our own points of view. Whenever we experience an event in our life, we not only experience it from our own point of view, but we hear stories about it from other people who were also there. And we see pictures, videos taken during the event. Each one of these things are going to capture something different. None of them are going to capture it objectively. Even with photography, what gets photographed and what does not is a subjective decision. Camera angle, lighting, photobombs. All of these things are subjective decisions on the part of the person with the camera. So we all have these accounts that accrue within an individual who both lived and who have both lived and heard of the accounts. The logical self assumes that each one of these stories or other artifacts takes on the position of a character. The self, the person who lived this event, travels over the, quote, imagined terrain to each of these characters to hear their account to help understand what happened. Each of these characters is an independent consciousness not controlled by the author of the story, the self. So the self stands beside these characters to create a unified, if only temporary. Stories do change. Photographs get their meanings reinterpreted. So they only have a temporary sense of the experience. Now, if anyone happens to own the rights to the quotation mark, I owe you a lot of money right now for that last paragraph. I say that jokingly, but that kind of points out a problem with this theory. It goes too far in its use of the metaphor. Cresswell and Beervelt point out that Herrmanns loses a lot of concreteness of Bakhtin's ideas. These aren't just characters in a story. These are actual people who experience these actual events from an actual point of view in the concrete world. Now, Salgado and Clegg present characteristics all dialogic theories share, and perhaps this is a good thing to end the presentation with. All dialogical theories of the self or of psychology have six similarities, or they all present the same 6 characteristics. Number 1, the primacy of relations. It's not the individual self that matters, but it is the self engaged with the world and with the other. Number 2, relations are a dynamic and developing process. Nothing static in a relationship between the self and the other, or even in the relationship with the self, between the self and itself. Change is constant. We're all in the process of becoming. We're all in the process of being. Ideas change, memories change, people change. 3, the human relations are mediated by signs. We can't randomly inhabit other people's bodies and get their points of view or read their minds. We're limited to using words in order to share experiences to get our point across. Now that's going to hinder things because interpretations of signs are going to vary based upon the individual. 4, that a relationship implies alterity, that is, a relationship between I and other. This is related to number 1, but I want to raise an issue here. Self and other are, according to Bakhtin, the fundamental split. This is the 2 necessary moments for interaction. The split is between concrete beings, not theoretical entities, not possible beings. I and the other are actual living beings that can't be abstracted from that condition, ever. 5, human relationships are dialogical or negotiated relationships. The I comes into play here. Each participant brings expectations and desires to the table, and each brings what they want to accomplish in the interaction. What occurs from that is a negotiation, not always verbalized, of these odds. And these are things that are not always spoken. These are things that sometimes get worked out within the individuals. And finally, number 6, that dialogical relationships include and depend upon a social cultural context. One cannot abstract or generalize about interactions, as each one is concrete and unique and occupies a unique space-time. Lose that and you lose any understanding of the nature of interaction. Thank you.